Yes, good morning, everybody. I'm very glad to see everybody here, and I hope you had a good night. Some had perhaps a shorter night and were tired, but I'm very glad to see you. And we have a very interesting lecture this morning. It's Professor Lily Gardner-Feldman who will talk. She comes from the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies at Johns Hopkins University in Washington. They have the motto, providing knowledge, insight, and network for the future. I think this is a good idea, and it's corresponding well with some of you said that they want here, knowledge, insights, and network for the future. Dr. Lily Gardner-Feldman is currently the Harrison and Helene Gray Senior Fellow at the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies at Johns Hopkins University, where she has recently published a book entitled Germany's Foreign Policy of Reconciliation, From Enmity to Amity. It's a very important book. It's something like the book, would not like to say the Bible, but it's a book where you can find really very much knowledge and information about the German policy of reconciliation, and it's a kind of general view, and I recommend very strongly this book. I also learned a lot from this book. She also directs the Institute Society, Culture and Politics program. Her formation and her PhD was in political science and MIT in Boston. And Boston was also a second place where she lived a long time and she worked during a long time. She was professor of political science at Tufts University in Boston. And also she was a research associate at Harvard University Center of European Studies and chaired and directed several activities there. She returned in 1999 to Johns Hopkins University and now is in Washington. And she gave a lot of lectures on German foreign policy, also on German-Jewish relation, international reconciliation, non-state entities as foreign policy players, and the EU as international actor. And I'm very glad that she found the time to come here. She is a very much demanded person, and you ask her to go to several countries. She has been in East Asia, in European countries, and 4 times she has been in Germany this year. And we are glad that she came once here for our summer school. So thank you very much for coming, and we are happy to hear you this morning with your presentation.
Maybe you can see me just over the screen.
Do you need a microphone or you want to speak without?
Probably without the microphone.
Okay.
Is it possible to put this screen down?
Of course.
Great. Okay. That's one of the disadvantages of being short, that when you come to a lectern, you often have to readjust things. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So the room's a little different, and I think I preferred the other configuration because it was more intimate. There's kind of a distance physically between us, but hopefully that will disappear as we start talking about the subject. But first, let me thank the Center for the generous invitation and all of you for the opportunity to talk about reconciliation. As Professor Leiner just said, I am a political scientist, so I might be an intruder here, but I'm also I employ an interdisciplinary approach in my work, so I very much benefit from being with people in other disciplines, particularly in this case theology, and the center is in the Faculty of Theology, and I think that is a very good home for it. So let me start by, I'm going to talk about 3 areas of reconciliation in these 2 cases: achievements, challenges, and limits. But before I do that, I'd like to make 3 general or introductory remarks. And to start that, I'd like to suggest a framing of the topic, or I'd like to prevent the bookends to the topic. To do that, I want to offer some incisive comments from practitioners involved in German-Polish and Polish-Russian reconciliation processes. And I want to emphasize process, as I have at other times in the workshop or in the summer school, because I believe that reconciliation is a long-term, dynamic, interactive phenomenon. We need to be talking about relationships. We need to be talking about processes. So let me start with Chancellor Willy Brandt writing about his Ostpolitik, his opening to Eastern Europe. And this was, that Ostpolitik began in the 1960s, and this is what he wrote about it. And I'm quoting, "We shall not attain a real accommodation until peace, cooperation, reconciliation, and yes, I hope one day friendship as well will prevail, not only in the West, but also between Germany and its neighbors in the East." This is talking about the mid-1960s. He went on to say that such a process would require, and I quote, "careful spade work." So he had great ambitions for relations with the East, but he recognized that it would be very difficult. So jump forward 50 years, and we have the words of Polish Foreign Minister Sikorski in 2011, demonstrating that Poland's historic fears of Germany had largely been vanquished. This is what he said in 2011, and it's a pretty well-known statement. So he said, "What do I regard as the biggest threat to the security and prosperity of Poland? It's certainly not German tanks. Rather, it would be the collapse of the Eurozone." This is before the whole Russia-Ukraine. "I demand of Germany that you help it," meaning the Eurozone, "survive and prosper. I will probably be the first Polish foreign minister to say so. I fear German power less than I'm beginning to fear German inactivity. You have become Europe's indispensable nation." This is a remarkable statement for a Polish foreign minister or any Polish leader to make, given German-Polish history. To come to the Polish-Russian relationship, 2 years later, in 2013, Poland's deputy foreign minister referred to Polish-Russian relations in less easy, but still hopeful terms. And I'm quoting, "Our relations with Russia are important, difficult, but full of potential. Good relations take a long time to build." He then added a note of caution, "But everything can be destroyed in a single moment." That moment, we could say, came with the Ukraine crisis earlier this year, which caused the director of the Center for Polish-Russian Dialogue and Understanding in Warsaw, Sławomir Debski, to lament, and I'm quoting, "If we are talking about confidence building between our political elites, our job just became much more difficult. There's no proof right now that the Russians are interested in building confidence with anybody." So those quotes, those 4 quotes, I think, tell us a lot about these 2 examples of reconciliation. For a short period of about 10 years, Polish-Russian relations seem to have embarked on a trajectory of reconciliation, borrowing from the decades-long German-Polish reconciliation path and experience. But that movement clearly has now been impaired. The question is whether this is a temporary or a permanent rupture in relations. Second introductory remark I want to make relates to the issue of caution regarding the utility of comparison and analogy. And some people are very concerned about trying to transfer ideas and experiences from one geographical setting to another. I understand the caution, but I still think it's useful. So even though history, culture, institutions, and context are different in the two cases that I'm trying to look at here, comparison, I think, is still legitimate as it opens up analytical and practical frameworks. It allows us to have some organizing principles for looking at other cases, for posing questions, even if the answers are different depending on the context. And then the third introductory point I want to make refers to the overall similarities and differences regarding German-Polish and Polish-Russian reconciliation. And here I want to make 4 points about similarities and differences, and then I'll really elaborate on that in the rest of my remarks. The first area is the nature of the process of reconciliation. We can see a long-standing process in the one case, a long-standing mature process in the one case, as opposed to an incipient or infant process in the other case, meaning the Polish-Russian case. We can see a reciprocal kind of reconciliation, or reciprocity being the basis of reconciliation in the German-Polish case, whereas it's more unilateral in the Polish-Russian case. We can see a very institutionalized idea of reconciliation in the German-Polish case, whereas we can see much more an ad hoc arrangement in Polish-Russian relations. The second point I would make, overall point I would make, is the definition of reconciliation. In the German-Polish case, we definitely can see a maximal definition of reconciliation as the attitudinal and institutional transformation from enmity to amity, as opposed to the minimal notion of reconciliation as rapprochement, peaceful coexistence in the Polish-Russian case. Just to be clear, in neither case, neither type involves harmony. I would argue here and argue elsewhere that contention, contestation, differences are part of reconciliation. What separates these two cases is the much greater ability in one, namely in the German-Polish case, to manage or resolve differences. That's much greater than in the Polish-Russian case. That's why I call one maximal, the other minimal. But in both, there is contestation. The question is how it's dealt with. The third point I would make is about the character of the actors. And there we come to issues of victim-perpetrator categories, with Poland as a victim, no matter how we see it, certainly in both sets of reconciliation relationships. Russia as perpetrator with respect to Poland, but Russia generally perceiving itself in regional and world affairs as victim. That's its self-perception. And also regarding the actors, we need to talk about both governments and civil societies. Both are very important. And as a result, I'd like to emphasize here the two German words that are used for reconciliation. One is Versöhnung, which is an emotional, spiritual, psychological dimension of reconciliation. And the other is Aussöhnung, which is the practical, pragmatic notion of reconciliation. So I'm really suggesting in reconciliation, in many ways, we see dualities. Wherever we look in a process of reconciliation, we will see dualities. And this notion of two meanings for reconciliation in the German language, I think, sums that up. And then we also have to see, in terms of the character of the actors, Poland and Russia as both subject and object. I also think it's important to emphasize in these general similarities and differences the role of history in reconciliation. In the German-Polish case, it's embedded. It's always there. It's a fundamental part of the fabric of the relationship. Whereas in the Russian-Polish relationship, it's much more superficial. Not from the Polish perspective, obviously, but from the Russian perspective. It's not taken as a fundamental feature, accepted as a fundamental feature of the relationship. And then finally, a point of similarity and difference, the larger context in which the bilateral relationships or these two dyads are set. And there I mean the regional and international environments for the bilateral relationship. So let me get to the three lenses for evaluating reconciliation: achievements, challenges, and limits. And in each of those three areas, I'll compare German-Polish and Russian-Polish relationships. I think these three lenses allow us to see both the opportunities and the obstacles in reconciliation. As I said, we see always dualities. It allows us to see the optimism and the pessimism in reconciliation. And looking at reconciliation using these three lenses, I think we can see that reconciliation is messy. It's a messy process, it's a long-term process, and it's also a non-linear journey. It's not a straightforward path. So let me look at the achievements of reconciliation in German-Polish and Polish-Russian relations. First, I would mention the major general achievement of German-Polish reconciliation. That is that it is transformed from a community of disputes, and that is the term of Irena Lipowitz, the former coordinator for German-Polish relations in the Polish Foreign Ministry. It's transformed from a community of disputes to a close partnership, or what Karl Deutsch called a pluralistic security community, where disagreements are secondary, not absent, but secondary, and trust has been established. In Polish-Russian relations, I would refer to rapprochement, and that at least was before the Russia-Ukraine crisis. We could collectively talk about another label for it today, but before the actual crisis, I think we could refer to rapprochement, where there were some elements of cooperation, but no sense of community, and the reality of a relationship focused around disputes. It was cooperative, but it was still focused around disputes, both bilateral disputes to do with history as well as economics, and regional disputes, for example, over democracy or democratization and the Western orientation of Ukraine. That's before the crisis we know today broke out. Let me now just address the specific ingredients that I think are essential for international reconciliation. We've spoken a lot in the course of the last few days really about internal reconciliation. I'm clearly talking about international reconciliation. The ingredients may be similar, but there may be some differences between the two types of reconciliation. But here, at least, for international reconciliation, I'd like to suggest the following ingredients or requirements. First, the acknowledgement of unresolved historical issues and of lingering traumas. Secondly, history has to be a centerpiece in relations of reconciliation, not just a footnote. The third point I would make is there has to be a balance of moral and pragmatic motives. The fourth requirement is a committed civil society. The fifth is the necessity of robust and vibrant institutions. The sixth is vision and courage on the part of political and societal leaders. And finally, one has to have a supportive regional and international environment for reconciliation to be able to flourish. So let me look at those. I think there's 7 items in these 2 cases. So reconciliation hinges on the recognition of grievances, the acknowledgement of grievances emanating from the heart of past conflict. This has occurred consistently and over the long term in multiple ways in German-Polish reconciliation. It's not just once that it happened or a couple of times. Consistently, there is a recognition on Germany's part of what it did to Poland. Just to give you some examples, there have been statements and speeches from the speech, for example, in 1958 already, by Carlo Schmidt, a social democratic politician who was involved in Franco-German, German-Israeli, and also German-Polish reconciliation, major speech at Warsaw University already in 1958. So you can go from there, and then I could give you multiple examples. But through the speech in just last month in July by President Gauck, for an exhibition on the 70th anniversary of the Warsaw Uprising, an exhibition in Berlin. He, together with the Polish president, inaugurated the exhibition, and the statements were very important, again acknowledging what Germany had done. You can look at treaties, the language of treaties, the 1970 treaty, the 1991 treaty. The language in those treaties is very, very specific about what Germany recognizing Poland as victim. You can also look at symbolic gestures. I think everybody knows the iconic image of Willy Brandt kneeling at the Warsaw Ghetto Memorial. And then I would also note as a more recent symbolic gesture the fact that President Gauck chose Poland as the location of his first foreign visit as president. That was not just a haphazard decision. It was a very pointed decision. So all of these things are recognition on the part of Germany of what it did to Poland. Now, in the Polish-Russian case, a beginning was discernible the last few years with Russian acknowledgement of culpability. Finally, took a long time, and I know Jolanta will be speaking about this in more detail, much more detail. Acknowledgement of culpability for the 1940 Katyn massacre of some 20,000 of Poland's elite. That really began in 1990. It included the joint dedication of Polish and Russian memorials at Katyn in the year 2000, as well as the 2010 condemnation by the Russian Duma of Stalin's role in ordering the massacre. Another example, we could see the Russian wreath laying after the Smolensk plane crash. I think you're all familiar with that, when the Polish president and a number of politicians, cabinet members also lost their lives. And of course, they were on their way to a major commemoration in Russia of the Katyn killings. During his visit to Gdansk on the 70th anniversary of the outbreak of World War II, Putin made a significant statement on reconciliation, referencing the Franco-German model and the possibilities in Russian-German relations, but also the conviction that Polish-Russian relations could follow suit. So these are some small elements of Russian recognition, acknowledgement of Polish grievances. Of course, things change, but I just want to say that there was a process that was beginning. So the second aspect of reconciliation, history not being just a footnote. For me, that's essential for reconciliation. That has been, in German-Polish reconciliation, history has been what I call a constant companion to the development of the relationship. It's what I call a constructive irritant. It can cause problems in relations, but my argument is that you need to be able to deal with problems because, in fact, that authenticates reconciliation. What's the point of having reconciliation if when there's a crisis it all falls apart? So there will always be differences over history, but it's the ability to deal with those differences, and history has to always be there. It's not that you look at it once at the beginning of the relationship and then it disappears, we've dealt with that. That's why I don't like this notion of Vergangenheitsbewältigung, mastery of the past, which suggests, okay, we did it, it's over, we don't need to bother with that anymore. Much more useful is the German term Aufarbeitung, which means it's a continuous effort to deal with history. And so some examples of how this has happened in the German-Polish case. The work of the German Historical Institute in Warsaw, all kinds of work, I won't go into it here, but its work is a demonstration that history continues to be present. It's not history as past, but history as present. And of the German-Polish Institute in Darmstadt, constantly focusing on historical issues. The work of the bilateral textbook commission between Germany and Poland, meetings, recommendations, volumes, and of course there is a joint now German-Polish history textbook. Those are just some examples, but I could give you many more. In Polish-Russian relations, this notion of history not just as a footnote. There was the initiation and work of the government-generated Committee on Difficult Matters, which I think is just an incredible title for a Committee on Difficult Matters. That was a very important first step that history would continue to be important, that the two countries would be involved in the process of looking at difficult matters, including the joint publication on, the title is White Spots, Black Spots, Difficult Issues in Polish-Russian Relations, 1918-2008. That actually was, that document came out. And then plans for publication of documents concerning the period 1918-1945, and a publication about the years 1939-1945. So some suggestion of history kind of finding its way, being integrated into the relationship. Now, with regard to the third ingredient of reconciliation, the twin motivational elements of moral imperative and pragmatic interest, those really are balanced and have been balanced in the German-Polish relationship. You do have both elements. Sometimes the weight of the two elements changes, but overall you have a balance. Whereas they've been much more, the balance has been much more heavily weighted in the direction of pragmatism in the Polish-Russian relations, especially on the Russian side. Another key requirement of reconciliation is the evolution of bilateral institutions. So we're not talking about ad hoc ties. We're talking about institutional ties at the societal and governmental levels. And I think institutions are important, or institutionalization is important, because it provides solidarity in times of crisis. Institutionalization provides predictability. It provides reliability, calculability, and I think this is very important, some sense of symmetry in what are asymmetrical relations in terms of material power. Here I would like to talk about the role of civil society and civil society institutions. They were catalysts for German-Polish relations. They were important at the beginning, and they continue to be crucial today, starting in the early 1950s in connections between religious groups, not just Catholic connections, but also Protestant connections, starting already in the 50s, especially 1965, the Polish Catholic Bishops' Initiative, granting forgiveness and asking for forgiveness, granting forgiveness regarding Germany's wartime aggression, asking for forgiveness regarding the suffering of Germans in the expulsion from territory that became part of Poland after the war. And there were also activities of lay leaders, German lay leaders, that were very important in 1965. Those early pre-1989 connections included activity by private economic actors, as well as town twinnings and think tank fora. It's very important to understand that before 1989, there were the small steps of reconciliation. The foundation was already there before 1989. After 1989, they expanded. They grew exponentially to all branches of society. For example, trade unions, chambers of commerce, cultural institutes, friendship associations, youth exchange, political foundation activities. The ties have been deep, regular, consequential, and I think are a much more important gauge of public attitudes towards reconciliation than opinion surveys. Opinion surveys give us a snapshot, whereas looking at these societal institutions, we get a panoramic view over a long period of time of what's happening in relations. Now, to come to the Polish-Russian case in terms of civil society institutions, there is now, arising from this Committee on Difficult Matters, there are now centers for Polish-Russian dialogue and understanding in Warsaw and in Russia. I think they were an important institutional signal dealing gradually with history issues, youth exchange, cultural connections, academic ties. They were a beginning. It's another question where they've gone, but they were a beginning. Then also the Polish-Russian church activities, dialogues, statements, visits. I think they were a necessary and helpful initiative. For example, the visit of the Russian Patriarch to Poland in 2012, with a joint appeal for Polish-Russian reconciliation, and a later meeting of church representatives and academics on the topic of Christianity in the 21st century, remembrance, forgiveness, reconciliation. We can talk about forgiveness later, because I think a number of us here we differ on the importance of forgiveness and reconciliation. The problem is these elements, small elements of institutionalization, haven't had the depth and the breadth that they have developed in German-Polish societal connections. If we look then at institutions at the governmental level, and this really is the fifth area of reconciliation, between Germany and Poland we see many bureaucratic, official relationships. They're extensive. We have stable institutional partnerships for cooperation, problem solving, for example, in the areas of the environment, energy, culture, cross-border issues. I'd like to emphasize here, in this notion of institutionalization, economic and defense ties between Germany and Poland. I think those areas are essential for reconciliation because the first, the economic area, establishes interdependence, and the second confirms that war is impossible. And both of those things seem to be critical in reconciliation. Now, economic activity is a private affair, obviously. It goes on between private parties. But governments can promote economic activity and can provide incentives. And since the early 1990s, Germany has been Poland's leading trade partner, and Polish trade for Germany is not insignificant. So the economic relationship is important. Germany is the most important foreign investor in Poland. So, these links are not haphazard or ad hoc. They're very central, they're very significant. On the military side, between Germany and Poland, intensive defense cooperation developed after 1989, especially after Poland's 1999 entry into NATO. And that the defense cooperation has entailed regular visits of defense ministers and their subordinates, close cooperation in the multinational core Northeast, which is part of NATO, training of Polish officers in German military academies and officers' schools, joint exercises, joint maneuvers, and the provision and sale of important weapons like Leopard tanks. This is a very important set of activities again, because once you integrate in some sense militaries, it's much harder. You do have the impossibility of war. Now, the high point of German-Polish institutional arrangements are the joint annual cabinet consultations. Germany has this arrangement with several, not many countries, where much of the cabinets on both sides come together for two purposes. First, for practical and political dialogues, where they reach agreements on various fields of domestic and foreign policy cooperation. And also they're important in a second way because those cabinet consultations allow for strategizing, joint strategizing about the future. I think symbolically they're important too because they reaffirm reconciliation. They show what reconciliation can be all about in political terms. Now, if we look at Polish-Russian institutionalization at the governmental level, it's been much more ad hoc, and it's not really part of an overall framework as it is in the German-Polish case. There is the Committee the Committee for Polish-Russian Cooperation Strategy, that's its name, which held its 8th meeting in December 2013. So there was some history to it, a short history to it. And a joint foreign minister statement committed the two sides to Programme 2020, so there was some sense of already planning for the future, prioritizing areas of cooperation. The ministries of culture, education, infrastructure and development, and the economy were at this meeting, again showing that it covered a range of areas. An important discussion topic was the border traffic between Poland's northeastern voivodeships and the Russian Kaliningrad Oblast. So there were some very practical aspects to it. At least as a beginning, again, economic ties are clearly not insignificant. Russia is Poland's 5th most important export market and its 2nd most important import market. Regarding defense matters, in Polish-Russian ties, there was Polish suspicion of planned joint German-Russian maneuvers in summer 2013 that resulted in their cancellation because Poland was so concerned about these German-Russian military maneuvers, they were cancelled. But one of Poland's important newspapers at the time advocated joint military maneuvers among the 3 countries, among Germany, Russia, and Poland. And there certainly was an informal framework for discussion of military matters among the 3, the so-called Kaliningrad Triangle of foreign ministers that had met for the 3rd time in May 2013. Now, this tentative forum is modeled after the well-established Weimar Triangle, which was one of the groups at the very first session in the summer school. That was inaugurated in 1991 among the foreign ministers of Germany, France, and Poland for regular discussion and action on a range of policy issues, including, as you know, the unsuccessful attempt to mediate the internal Ukraine crisis in February 2014, but also the joint statement of rebuke of Russian behavior in April of this year after the takeover of Crimea. The 6th requirement of reconciliation, success in part of German-Polish reconciliation can be ascribed to the political leadership in both countries committed to reconciliation and willing to show courage and vision in the face of domestic opposition. And I really want to underline domestic opposition, because reconciliation, again, does not happen easily. There are interests pitted against reconciliation, and in those contexts you need leaders who are able to step forward and show their commitment, to be courageous about the path of reconciliation. And that entails not only individuals, but what I call leadership pairs or leadership tandems of personal and policy friends like Schmidt, before 1989, Schmidt and Gierek, Kohl and Mazowiecki, and obviously more recently Merkel and Tusk. And we should also note the very close personal relationship between Sikorski and Steinmeier, the German foreign minister. And it has policy ramifications, which I can go into later if you wish. In Polish-Russian relations, there's nothing comparable. Although there have in the past been good working relationships, not friendships, as in the Polish case, between former Polish Foreign Minister Adam Rotfeld and the Russian academic Anatoly Turkunov. They've been the joint heads of the Committee on Difficult Matters. They appeared, for example, a joint appearance at the OSCE December 2012 Conference on Reconciliation. Samuel was at that conference, as was I. But that's just an example. And there were good working relations between Polish Foreign Minister Sikorski and Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov. Again, this is all pre the real development of the crisis. And then finally, moving from the individual to the larger multilateral level, Polish-German reconciliation preceded Poland joining NATO and the EU, but we shouldn't forget that Germany was the key advocate of Polish membership in both organizations. And mature reconciliation between the two countries, between Poland and Germany, has been forged in the context of multilateral organizations after 1989, especially in the EU. So bilateral reconciliation has shaped and been shaped by the European Union. And in addition, the German-Polish couple or tandem was actively supported by the United States. Now, this multilateral focus brings me to the second area that I want to talk about, general area, which is the area of challenges. I've suggested some of the positive dimensions, the achievements, but let me now look at the challenges. And here I'd like to look at earlier challenges and current challenges, at bilateral challenges and multilateral challenges. As I noted at the outset, reconciliation does not equal harmony. But reconciliation contains and manages conflict and contestation in a cooperative framework. Just to be very, very clear, contestation is part of reconciliation, not its counterpoint. Vicissitudes, ups and downs, are normal in reconciliation. Crises in German-Polish reconciliation have authenticated reconciliation, have strengthened it, have demonstrated that there is challenge, that there are challenges, but the challenge can be addressed and either overcome or managed, and there can be forward movement and the forging of trust. Now, in the German-Polish case, crises have often been over history-based issues, notably after the year 2000, particularly between 2005, 2007, with a nationalist government in Poland, and resurgent demands of German expellee organizations. We're talking about territorial issues, expulsion issues, compensation issues, the return of cultural artifacts, very heated issues. What's interesting, as far as governments, the two governments were concerned, there were constructive outcomes to these disputes, these conflicts. And they emerged in joint or coordinated responses by the two governments. For example, on the compensation issue, the two governments acted together They appointed a committee of inquiry, a committee of experts that came to a conclusion that there was no validity to compensation claims, and it was a joint effort, which was a sign of reconciliation. Whereas on the expulsion issue, there's been much more the approach of agree to disagree, with the German government's supporting this Center Against Expulsion in Berlin, featuring the plight of German expellees, and Polish government, Polish society, much, much more concerned about that. But they agreed to disagree. Tensions have occurred over differing perspectives. Even still in the early stages of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, there were still differences between Germany and Poland over Russia. This has been an old point of difference. How to deal with Russia. Germany advocating the embedding of Russia, treating Russia as a partner, especially in economics, whereas Poland has perceived Russia much more as a threat. These are very different perspectives. The positions have become closer following the downing of the Malaysian plane, and the German government, public opinion, and economic actors accepting, it seems, the need for a tougher approach. But there are still considerable differences between the German and Polish approaches. Now, once Poland became a member of the EU in 2004, it was more and more the fact of disputes in the EU as opposed to bilateral disputes. They disagreed over a variety of issues in the EU, the budget, the constitutional framework, foreign and security policy. Remember the differences between Germany and Poland over the US war in Iraq, major difference. But the two sides reached compromise due to the nature of their bilateral relationship. The framework of reconciliation enabled them to reach compromise on policy disputes. There were also German-Polish differences over the question of Ukraine becoming a member of the EU and of NATO, but the two countries still work together. The foreign ministers Steinmeier and Sikorski, for example, traveled together to Kiev, went as a unit as opposed to two separate countries in many ways. They tried to develop a structural relationship between the EU and Ukraine. They tried to promote its democratization, particularly after 2009. Chancellor Merkel has had an easier time working with Prime Minister Tusk in the EU, in part because of their close personal relationship. Now, if we turn to Polish-Russian relations in the area of differences and challenges, again, prior to the real chasm over Ukraine, the two sides already had confrontations in a variety of areas over material issues like Russian bans on Polish food products, claiming that they didn't meet Russian standards, or over fundamental issues of trust, the Polish view that Russia was withholding documents, was not telling the full truth about the Katyn massacre, or by still retaining the wreckage of the plane that crashed in Smolensk. These are, from the Polish point of view, these sow seeds of mistrust as opposed to trust. And we see that the policy institutions that had begun to develop were not yet fully there. They were not rooted. They were very, very superficial. There was not yet time to develop them so that they could contain threats and recriminations. On the emotional side, I think we have to remind ourselves, and we have several times here, that truth-telling is an absolute requirement of reconciliation. There were already divergences between Russia and Poland over Ukraine's internal complexion and its external place in a wider Europe. That was already there before March 2014. It didn't come out of nowhere. But the Russian takeover of Crimea and the subsequent Russian support for separatists in Ukraine moved tensions and therefore the fate of reconciliation to a whole other level. And here we get to limits, the third part of what I want to talk about today. We should remember that a reconciliation process has to promise entrenched, multifaceted, trustful relations, incorporating the impossibility of physical and material threats. In identifying limits, I want to refer back to these main ingredients of a reconciliation pathway. So in the place of the nascent development of some kind of security community, we see the reality of fundamental Polish insecurity due to Russian behavior. Reigniting fears of historical domination, Poles view Russia as a rogue state, violating sovereignty, employing military tools for political purposes, using economic boycotts, particularly over the import of Polish agricultural products, or the threat of economic boycotts with the energy issue, to cower states in the region. Now, does the new history war that's developing in the Ukraine crisis, does it mean that Russia will not move forward on historical issues with Poland? It's a very big question, very important question. Does it mean that by adding a new layer of historical wounds and a Russian revisionist narrative of history, does it mean that reconciliation becomes impossible? It's a fundamental question now. Quite simply stated, with his actions in Ukraine, the personality and leadership style of Putin suggests an obstacle to Polish-Russian reconciliation. And looking at the multilateral level, not only is the EU not accepted by Russia as an organization, its very values, including the foundational value of reconciliation. Remember, the basis of the European community was reconciliation. So those very values are challenged by Russian behavior in Ukraine and by the development of the alternative Eurasian Economic Union. Poland, obviously, squarely, organizationally, and in terms of values and leadership, rests in the EU camp. So there is this fundamental opposition between where the two sides see themselves belonging, which we could suggest makes reconciliation impossible. Because effective reconciliation requires joint membership or structural connections in a regional organization. Now, one joint forum, because it's not going to be the EU, obviously, nor NATO, obviously. One joint forum is the OSCE, but it doesn't carry the structural, political, or economic weight of the EU. However, the OSCE has tried to be constructive in the Ukraine crisis and has focused previously on reconciliation in its programming. So there are available, if people choose to use these channels, there are available organizational, bureaucratic, and personal networks between Poland and Russia in that framework. Again, the question is whether people will use those assets. Now, at the time of intense crisis, civil society can emerge as a major channel for communication and dialogue. However, however, we know that Putin, in general, has clipped the wings of civil society in Russia, including those with international connections. That's been happening for a while. Again, that's not just recent. So the question is, can transnational civil society relations flourish when the Russian government has a negative attitude to its own civil society as an independent, respected actor? One of the achievements of the incipient, and I emphasize incipient, Polish-Russian reconciliation was the decision to have a Polish-Russian year in 2015 that would showcase the connections between the two societies in culture and in science. Poland has now cancelled that plan, but the newly named Polish ambassador to Russia has indicated that there will still be cultural exchanges. So it's not as if there is the complete absence of relations. She said just 2 weeks ago, and I quote, "It is essential that people have the opportunity to learn and understand each other." And she said that there were plans to continue youth exchange. They would not stop. We need to ask, however, if these societal ties are strong and resilient enough to withstand the burdens of political conflict between Poland and Russia. The essential question is whether the current crisis in Russian-Polish relations over history and over geopolitics present an opening for reconciliation because the situation is so bad, or whether they amount to an invalidation of the nascent reconciliation that was beginning to exist. But we shouldn't pose the question of limits only for Polish-Russian reconciliation. We also need to pose the issue of limits in the so far successful case of German-Polish reconciliation. Is Polish-German reconciliation without limits in terms of areas of policy and societal engagement? Has it reached a point where crisis definitively does not mean the unraveling of the special partnership? And I think two issues will provide important answers. The opening of the Center Against Expulsion in the next years in Berlin that showcases the plight of Germans as victims, not Germans as perpetrators, but Germans as victims, and the attitude and commitment of a younger generation to active friendship and reconciliation. In both cases, we're talking about institutionalization. On the one side, with the expellees in the center, the institutionalization of resentment in many ways, and on the other side, the institutionalization on the part of younger people of openness and tolerance. I think the second issue is the most relevant. For the first one, the question of the Center Against Expulsion, it's one item and it's important, but it's one item in a much larger framework of relations of reconciliation between the governments and between German and Polish societies. There are many other things to counterbalance it. So I think the question of how the younger generation will deal with reconciliation is much more important. These are questions of the future, ones that you, I think, can answer better than I can, but I at least can pose those questions. The first one, is the current generation of Polish and German young people ready for the type of dedication and leadership displayed by previous generations? Equally important is the question of whether societal institutions can revise and revamp their goals and programs to resonate with the challenges facing the current generation. We can't have ossified institutions. Institutions need to change. So can they respond to and can they animate the aspirations of young people in the 21st century? Third question I would emphasize is how can societal actors and institutions in Polish-German relations recruit new leadership? They need to do this in a very conscious way. And finally, can we establish new channels through which young leaders, as societal actors, can be drawn into decision-making fora with governments? And here I want to really emphasize the point that there's a lot of interest now in civil society. People are beginning to study it, but we have to look at the links between civil society and governments. Let me conclude, so I think I'm adhering to your card. Let me conclude on a note of optimism. I think ultimately that's what reconciliation is all about, even though it's a difficult process, as I've said. It's at times there are stages of pessimism, but in the end it's about optimism. Now, despite serious and perhaps intractable conflict in the post-Soviet space, I think Willy Brandt's inscription at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier in Warsaw in December 1970 still resonates 4 decades later. This is what he said. This is what he wrote: "In memory of the dead of the Second World War and of the victims of violence and betrayal, in the hope of an enduring peace and of solidarity between the nations of Europe." that peace and solidarity, I think, or those elements of peace and solidarity have largely been achieved between Germany and Poland. I think that is a reality. In the Polish-Russian case, there's peaceful coexistence. There is the absence of war. That has been achieved, but it's not certain that peaceful coexistence will endure, and it has certainly not led to solidarity. So I think here we see, if we in the end compare these two cases, we see one case of reconciliation, and if we were to judge Polish-Russian relations today, we would see a case of non-reconciliation. What you actually call it, I'm not sure. But we did see elements of a process of reconciliation beginning about 10 years ago. So, you know, looking at these two cases, to come back to my original point, you know, it gives us lenses onto varieties of reconciliations, requirements of reconciliation, where we can see obstacles, where we can see opportunities. So let me leave you with that, and I very much welcome your questions, challenges, observations. Thank you.